To kind of review a little bit of what we did last time, we looked at John chapter 2 and then segued into John chapter 3. And I mentioned that the author uses a really interesting technique that's commonly called bookending. In chapter 1, he starts with a section about John the Baptist and then moves in chapter 2 into the two accounts of Jesus, the beginnings or maybe the core of Jesus' conflict, not necessarily the beginnings, but the core of Jesus' conflict with the two major religious groups in Israel, the authorities, the Pharisees, who were a lay movement, and he conflicted really significantly with their ideas of ritual purity in using the stone vessels that were designed for ritual cleansing. And my daughter, whom I'm going to say no to right now, so the Pharisees didn't appreciate that at all. And then as I've looked at the Gospel of John, I think he deliberately, like sometimes you do in a movie, he moved forward the description of Jesus' cleansing of the temple from the last week of his life and put it right at the front in order to illustrate what Jesus' issues were and why the two major religious authority groups in Israel had trouble with him and resisted his message. Sure.
The other major religious group you're talking about, like the clerical portion of the temple and whatnot,
right?
Would they be called the Sadducees?
Yes. Yes. The sort of broader group you're talking about is the one that, when Jesus cleansed the temple, they decided, we're going to kill this guy. This is it. This is the final straw, because it threatened their economic base, and it also threatened their relationship with the Roman government. So they were the temple hierarchy and the priesthood. In Israel, there was one tribe who was designated as the priestly tribe, Levi, and there was a group within that which were the actual high priests. And in Israel, the history of it is kind of interesting, but they were deeply, deeply rooted in making sure that their economic base in the temple wasn't jeopardized. And Jesus called them out, basically, with this cleansing of the temple. So that's the temple hierarchy. Kind of if you want to put it this way, maybe the ideological side of them was the group called the Sadducees. And they were centered around the temple, but they also had some significant differences with the Pharisees. The Pharisees were more of a lay group, a powerful lay movement, religious political movement, which had all kinds of different folk in it. There were many of the early disciples of Jesus were Pharisees who were honestly seeking the salvation of Israel. Others of them were very narrow and legalistic, and Jesus went after them. In the Gospel of Matthew, you can read a couple chapters there where he was pretty serious about calling them out. And so the Pharisees, though, were more of a lay group, and their power came from the fact that they were such a large movement, and they were represented in the Supreme Council in Jerusalem called the Sanhedrin, or the major council of Israel. Of course, the Romans were the ones that really called the shots. They were the ones who appointed or demoted the high priests, which of course this stuck like a bone in the throat of all of Israel, that the Romans were in charge. This was not the way they thought it should be. And so, but under that were these two main power blocks. Along with the Pharisees, there's other groups also. This might be just worth mentioning. Judaism at the time of Jesus, which the Jewish people call the Second Temple period, because the first temple was Solomon's temple. It got destroyed by the Babylonians. The second temple was rebuilt when the people of Israel returned, and then it was significantly upgraded by Herod the Great. Started the puppet king who is described in the Gospels as the one who tried to have Jesus killed when he was an infant. And that was a huge project, and Herod put a lot of capital into that, and the temple became one of kind of the wonders of the world with its golden dome and everything. But so the temple itself was kind of the power center and the symbol of everything that Israel represented, both for the temple hierarchy. And the Pharisees had a lot of criticism about that. They criticized the priesthood, but they were too powerful for the priesthood to just brush aside. So that's kind of a long answer, but does that help kind of put up a map of where things are? So chapter 2 outlines the fact that Jesus was confronting the major power blocks in the nation. And then chapter 3 segues into a conversation with one of the main teachers of the Pharisees, Nicodemus. And that conversation is interesting because it shows again that there were Pharisees that were open to the message of Jesus. Hi, Chris. That were open to the message of Jesus. And actually, Nicodemus' story continues, and he ends up at the end of the story, so to speak, when he and Joseph of Arimathea take the body of Christ from the cross and bury it in Joseph's tomb. So Nicodemus has this encounter with Jesus, which we talked about. And then the other end of the bookend is this, there's another section talking about John the Baptist. And this is the last appearance of John the Baptist in the Gospel of John. He steps off the stage there. He makes his famous statement about Jesus: "He must increase, but I must decrease." And it's kind of an image of the sun and the moon. As the sun rises, the moon's light fades, and John recognized that Jesus was the one who was coming, and he was going to fade into insignificance. But if you look at the end of chapter 3, there's a really interesting statement. It says that when there's a wedding, the bridegroom's the key guy, and the friend of the bridegroom, which is a Jewish expression, I think, shoshbon, and he is the one who arranges the wedding, who makes sure everything's going properly and everything. And he says, in essence, Jesus is the bridegroom. Jesus is the one that Israel is made for, and I'm just here to help make that happen. So that's the end of the other bookend, starting with John the Baptist at the end of chapter 1 and closing that section. In that section, it describes Jesus' first encounters with his disciples. So what's happening in there is talking about people who follow Jesus. And Nicodemus, as we see later in the gospel, ends up following Jesus, although he doesn't join his band of disciples. And then chapter 4 begins. And that's where I'd kind of like to concentrate our first part tonight, is on John chapter 4. It's really interesting that John the evangelist, the source or writer of the gospel, puts these two very detailed personal conversations side by side with each other. He's contrasting and comparing the conversation that Nicodemus, the Pharisee, had with Jesus. That's chapter 3. And then he brings in chapter 4, it's the other really detailed, intense conversation that Jesus had with a woman at the well in Samaria, of all places. And in chapter 4, there are 54 verses, and 44 of them tell the story of Jesus' encounter with this woman in Samaria. Jewish sort of areas in the Holy Land were in the south around Jerusalem. That's the Roman province of Judea, and in the north in Galilee. Those are the two really significant Jewish population areas. In the middle was this area called Samaria. And the Samaritans were, how to describe them? They were viewed by the Jewish people as heretics and sort of half-Jews who weren't truly Jews. There'd been a long history of conflict between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. You can Google online if you want about the Samaritans. Their origin was that when the northern, there were two kingdoms of Israel, Judah and Israel, roughly corresponding to Judea and then Galilee in the north and the area of Samaria. The northern kingdom was destroyed and taken into exile by the world power of Assyria. They were bad hombres. And the whole population was basically taken away and distributed, and they never came back, basically. But there were people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire that were sort of exported into that area, and they adopted kind of a half-Jewish religion. They had the 5 books of Moses, and they had their own practices, their own priesthood, they had their own temple. And when the Jewish people, the second exile, was the exile of the southern kingdom of Judah under the Babylonians, and when they came back from exile, unlike the northern folk, and they found the Samaritans there, and there was a lot of bad blood between them. The Samaritans didn't like the Jewish people moving back in, so to speak. It's kind of like everything's been taken over, and what are you doing back here? And so there was a lot of tension between Samaritans and Jews, racial tension, religious tension. It was a huge, huge problem. And Jesus decides, out of the conflict with the Pharisees, that he is going to be leaving the southern part where he was, the southern area, and he decides he's going to head again north into Galilee, which was his original location in his home area. And it says in there a very interesting phrase. It says he had to pass through Samaria. Well, strictly speaking, that's not true. He didn't have to, in the sense of there was another way, which most Jews who went from the north to the south and back again used, and that was going to the east and then down the Jordan River Valley and then back up to Jerusalem. But the quickest way and the straight way was from north to south, and it led through the area of Samaria. And it says that Jesus had to travel through Samaria. And I take that as a spiritual have to, that this was his calling and his leading. And so Jesus then in verses 5 through 9, it says, as he was traveling with his disciples, I don't know if you know this series is Chosen, if you've ever seen it. There's in the second season, there's a great scene of where the disciples learn that Jesus is going to go through Samaria. And they say, whoa, wait a minute, this is not, no. And he says, trust me, come along, let's go. And so it says in verse 5, he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour, so that would be roughly noon. And a woman from Samaria came to draw water. The disciples apparently were gone. They were going to buy food in the village. And Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." We read this and we kind of think, okay, yeah, there's a well and people need water and things like that. But this is again an example of our cultural difference and distance from Jesus' situation. At first glance, it's kind of, oh yeah, okay, they met at this well. But we don't really catch at first glance, if we don't understand what's going on, the plot line here of what the Gospel of John is talking about. The story of Jesus' encounter with this Samaritan woman would have had a huge impact when it was told and then retold, because it's like the first act of a modern film. There's a very clear pattern in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible of encounters at wells. You guys, some of you are Bible people. You might remember some of them. Remember some encounters that men had with women at wells? Can you think of any? Jacob, right? Yeah, and Rebecca, right? Moses? Yeah, Moses and his wife, his later wife, right? Yeah. So, and these encounters at wells are, it's kind of like if a movie opens and you see a really sunlit, dusty street, and you see a guy from the back and he's got a holster on, and you hear a certain kind of music, you immediately know, okay, this is high noon, you know. This is a cowboy movie. These are two gunslingers. They're gonna have it out. It's either the sheriff or the bad guy. And we immediately think, okay, that's where it's at. So as soon as this scene opens, the immediate Jewish response would have been, oh yeah, okay, I've got it. This is a scene at the well. But there's some big issues here that starts. First of all, this highly regarded holy man stops for a break on a journey. And immediately you would kind of think, if you were Jewish at that time, this is the kind of movie we could show at the Methodist Ladies Society. But then it gets really tense, because suddenly the scene cuts to this pastor or holy man in the presence of a woman that isn't just a Samaritan, but also is morally compromised. And all of a sudden, if you were a hearer of this story for the first time and you were Jewish, your stomach would kind of tighten up and kind of, whoa, what's happening here? And bells start going off in your head. What's wrong with this picture? All the time, the dialogue is the holy man or the pastor having a suggestive conversation with the woman. There's all kinds of double innuendos in these conversations. And she immediately recognizes this. She says, "You're Jewish. What are you doing even speaking to me?" And she's trying to figure out what his deal is and what he's up to. And she's kind of like, the Germans have an expression, a cow on ice, you know? She's just kind of, what's going on here? And the gut impact that a Jewish hearer would have in the first century would have been, this story is loaded with tension. There's a lot of ambiguity, and there's a lot of things wrong with this story to start with. First of all, man meets woman at well. In the biblical stories, like in Genesis 24 or 29, are stories that end up with God doing something cool. So, but the scene is set for us. There's a holy man, Jesus, who's been proclaimed to be the Lamb of God, and he's speaking with a woman. That's the first problem. Well, the first problem, he's in Samaria. The second problem, he's speaking with a woman. One of the 6 activities the rabbis taught were unfitting for a scholar was talking with a woman, other than his wife, I hope. But at any rate, they felt it was a waste of time and opened up one to temptation. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, there's actually a movie called The Chosen, and it's worth watching. It's about modern conservative Judaism. It's a kind of a cool story. But there was this conflict about the other daughter. Sorry. We have neat times to communicate with our daughters, but I should turn my phone off. So there's this conflict, the ethnic conflict, and then there's this tremendous moral ambiguity that's going on in this conversation. And by this time, everybody that's listening to this story's ears are perked up. And there's this morally ambiguous woman. She was coming to the well alone at the wrong time of day. The signal was clear. She probably doesn't want to or can't be associated with the other proper women of the village. They don't want to be associated with her. And as the conversation with Jesus develops, it raises the tension of what is Jesus doing here? What's going on? And so verse 8 explains then that the disciples had gone to buy food, and the Samaritan woman then comes. So there's a lot of negative signals about her. There are traditional societies still today that where incredibly tight social rules govern this kind of a situation. In some traditional societies in the Middle East today, a personal encounter between a man and a woman that are not related is considered almost equivalent to sexual intercourse. This type of situation is intense. And if a man and a woman are alone for over 20 minutes, it's presumed that they've had sexual relationships. That's in some very conservative societies in the Middle East today. Well, I'm not sure that it was that radical, but it was definitely a highly charged situation. And she says immediately, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. What's implied is that Jews don't even use dishes or utensils that have been touched by Samaritans. And Jesus, she calls him a Jew, and he was. And he answers her, and he begins a discussion that takes place on 2 levels. Remember the discussion with Nicodemus about the wind. The wind blows, the Spirit blows. There's this wind spirit. This is the second time that Jesus does this with this comparison. Water and spiritual water, spiritual life. And so in verse 10, the woman begins a discussion that begins with Jesus on 2 separate levels. All kinds of things have been taking place with water. Jesus changed the water into wine. John the Baptist baptized with water. And he says to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that's saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. She's still programming on a normal social and physical level. And she says, how can you get water out of the well? It's really deep. You don't even have anything to draw the water out with. And Jesus, and then she starts this kind of religious discussion. Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave the well and drank from it, as did his sons and his livestock. And Jesus replies, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Well, she begins to realize this is more than just a chance conversation, and she says, Sir, give me this water so that I won't have to be thirsty and come here to draw water. She perhaps thought that Jesus was some kind of magician. He could give her a magic container of some kind that she would produce water for. And Jesus goes to the heart of her personal moral ambiguity, and he says, go call your husband and come here. And she says, I have no husband. Which Jesus then replies, you're right in saying, I have no husband. For you've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. The woman was obviously involved in serial marriages. It was usually a sign at that time of immorality, and it confirmed to John's hearers and readers this was not a respectable woman. It's also important to know that she had no legal protection. The man with whom she was now living grants her no legal status in the society, and she's viewed practically as a prostitute, a kept woman. And even today, she wouldn't be considered a first-rate witness for Jesus. But the point is that Jesus says then, God seeks people. He looks for people. That's what he's doing, is he's saying, I want you. I'm calling you. And we've seen that already in Jesus' calling of Philip. Just a tip, as you're reading through John, notice Philip. Philip isn't the brightest bulb in the box, but he's an ordinary guy. And the thing that's encouraging is Jesus took the initiative to go for Philip, and he calls him. And that's an encouragement to me, that Jesus isn't just after the elite, he's after ordinary people. God calls ordinary people. And here the reality is that he's beginning a conversation with a woman whom, technically speaking, if he were truly a holy man, he wouldn't be talking with her. And he says to her, go call your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband, which again is the ambiguity of the situation. And Jesus says, you're right. You've had multiple husbands, and the guy you're living with now is not your husband. And her response was, she says, you must be a prophet. And then she flips into this theological mode. And she says to Jesus, I've always had this question theologically. The Samaritans didn't accept all of the Hebrew Bible. And she said, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say, you Jews, Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. She's starting a theological argument with Jesus, or attempting to. And she raises a question about where people are supposed to worship God. Is it going to be in our temple here in Samaria, or is it going to be in your temple? And Jesus says then, in verse 21, woman, believe me. That's a word of respect, by the way. It was the same word he used when he addressed his mother in a formal way at the wedding in Canaan. He says to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. But God is seeking those who worship him in a new way, in spirit and in truth. And so in this whole conversation, Jesus is making clear something new is underway. And he very clearly puts himself in the Jewish circle. He says, "You're right, I'm Jewish." And he says in verse 22, "You worship what you do not know. We, Jews, worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." God's program of saving the world was centered around the Jewish people. And Jesus articulates this, and this is really key to understanding the entire message of the Bible. Is the problem that humanity has is sketched out in the book of Genesis, the first 3 chapters, where we as a race, as human beings, choose against God and go our own way. And the whole rest of the Bible is God's solution to that. It's God seeking his lost creation. And you have Noah, you have all of the things leading up to it, but the key place in the Bible that really nails things down about the way God is going to deal with our rebellion and our sin as humans begins in Genesis 12, where Jesus calls Abraham. Out of all of the peoples of the earth, God calls Abraham and his family, and they become kind of the receiving station, if you will, for God's revelation, for his explanation, for all that he's going to be doing to save the world. It doesn't mean there isn't truth elsewhere. We talked about the first night together. But it does mean that salvation, as Jesus said, is from the Jews. This is what Abraham and the story of Abraham is all about. And all of the history of the Jewish people is them dealing with this calling that God had given them, sometimes in faithfulness, sometimes in rebellion. And Jesus says to her very clearly, salvation is from the Jews. That people are going to be worshiping God, not only the Jewish people, but all of humanity are going to be worshiping God in true spirit, in God's spirit, because of everything that, because of salvation and what he's going to be doing. The Samaritan woman then says, I know Messiah is coming. This is kind of, the Samaritan word probably is what she used, which isn't exactly the Hebrew word for Messiah, but it's the author's translation of it. He was the revealer or restorer of truth, who was also promised in the Samaritan's thinking. And the woman says, in essence, well, I know that when the teacher, the restorer, the revealer comes, he's going to explain all these things and we'll understand everything. And then for the very first time, Jesus specifically explains, I'm that guy. He hasn't said it that way to anyone, even the disciples. But to this woman at the well, he says, I who speak to you, I'm the one. I am the one speaking to you. And as I said, we hadn't seen that kind of directness in the entire Gospel of John up until that point. Jesus is not just saying here, well, you could view me that way. He's making a deeper declaration of who he was to this woman. And he's actually the one seeking the true worshipers of God. And so Jesus meets this woman where she was at. And then everything gets interrupted. His disciples come back and they say, whoa, he's talking to a woman. They don't appear to have asked him about it. But the woman left her water jar that's a big deal. In verse 28, and said to the people, goes into the village and says, come see a man who told me all I ever did. Can this be the Christ? And then they go out and meet Jesus, and he ends up staying there for 2 days with his disciples. The disciples were having I'm sure a lot of tension with this whole thing, but Jesus was setting the pattern for the future, that they had to cross these cultural barriers. They had to get out of their own narrow concepts and go to the world. She left her water jar, and she goes and she says, come and see this man who's told me everything I ever did, which I'm sure got people's attention. She was clearly, in her own thinking, in her own society, defined by the mistakes that she'd made. And the darkness in her life had become her identity. And Jesus broke that. And she challenges the people of her village, come and see. That's a great, great thing. That appears more than once in the Gospels, where Jesus' followers just say, come and see, just come and look. And he explains to his disciples that there's a program going on here that they don't really know about. And so finally, the people from the village come out again, and the Samaritans are walking toward them, and Jesus says to the disciples, he said, look, there's a harvest of spiritual life here. These people are coming to me, and you need to be part of that. And it says in verse 39, many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. He accepted their hospitality and broke down the ethnic barrier that had kept them from associating the Jews from associating with the Samaritans. And then it explains that Jesus is the Savior of the entire world. Salvation is from the Jews. He's the one who is going to solve the original problem of our sin and of our separation from God. So that's just kind of a quick overview of what was going on there. But I think we'll take a break, and then I'd like to talk with you a little bit about Galilee, and because Jesus then moves on toward Galilee. And I'd like to kind of explain the difference between what was going on down in Jerusalem at the temple and what was happening up north in Galilee. So we'll just take a 5-minute break then.
How do you think John knew of this conversation? Since he wasn't there.
That's a great question. Yeah.
It was just Jesus and her at the well.
Right.
So
there's only 2 possible sources of information. Jesus or the woman,
yeah.
or both, And I think that I could well imagine that in the time that the disciples were, the days they spent in the village, that these conversations took place. Mm-hmm. Because I think she was talking constantly to the people in the village. This is what happened, this is what he said, this is what we did. And John filled in with what he knew, and maybe even asked Jesus about it. I think it's quite a natural process, but we didn't have a recorder,
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally at that time, someone like the author of the book of John, who would, particularly if there was eyewitness testimony involved here, if the source of the book of John, which we'll talk about this, but I believe there is a root here of one of the original followers of Jesus, traditionally called John the Evangelist, then it was easy for him to fill in and say, okay, this, and it was perfectly legitimate if a person had that kind of information to fill in the color and the details of it. So, yeah, that's just my own thought about it. Yeah, Drew?
Go back to John 4:1, where it says the Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John.
Yes.
I guess, what is the importance to this, 1 through 3, where it says he's baptizing more disciples than John, and then in 2 says, although in fact it was not actually Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. And then in 3, when the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went once more to Galilee. Like what is this saying? What is this setting up? Why is this?
The first question one can ask oneself with that kind of a question is there any indication previously in the text that might help us understand what was going on? There's obviously some tension there. Jesus hears this and he leaves. And it's associated with John the Baptist. So the best way, I think, to deal with that, kind of as close in as you can, is to dial back and sort of rewind and go back to John chapter 1. And if you remember in John chapter 1, the Pharisees had teamed up with their rivals from the temple hierarchy, and they'd set a delegation to basically interview and question John the Baptist. And they ask him all these questions. They say, "Are you the prophet that was coming?" And he says, "Nope." "Are you Elijah?" And he says, "Nope, at least not the way you understand it." "What are you? We've got to give an answer to the people that sent us." So there's obviously this tension going on with the movement of John the Baptist. And John was baptizing. That was the point. He was baptizing Jews. Water rituals in Judaism were well known. But this was a particular kind of baptism where they were signaling a new life. They were joining the movement of repentance, of turning their life around and heading for the kingdom of God and waiting for the promised one of Israel. So the Pharisees and the temple hierarchy were uncomfortable with this. And so they send this delegation and ask him about it. And the problem is he's baptizing. And then we come to your question and we read that. I would say go as close as you can to the text. Dial back and see if there's any explanation for it possible in the text. And I think it has to do with that skepticism of the Pharisees and the temple hierarchy, which, interestingly enough, is again underlined in John chapter 2, is you've got these two groups. And, okay, Jesus doesn't respect the Pharisees' ritual purity laws. And, by the way, he cleaned up the temple and really got the temple authorities. So I think there's a dynamic going on there where Jesus evaluated it and said, this is not the time for me to remain here. He comes back. He doesn't stay in Galilee, but he comes back. So that's kind of how I would approach that. Does that make sense? Since we brought it up, after spending 2 days with the Samaritans, Jesus continued on his trip to Galilee. And it's interesting in the Gospel of John that whenever the author of the Gospel of John or the source of the Gospel of John talks about issues in Judea, in the southern province, he usually explains the locations and the topography of Jerusalem, but he doesn't do that in Galilee. it seems like he kind of assumes that everybody knows what's what in Galilee. But he does explain locations like the topography of Jerusalem and different places in Jerusalem or in Judea. But he doesn't do that in Galilee. So it could imply that the Gospel of John is rooted in Galilee. And the interesting thing that I find is that that fits with two things. It fits, first of all, with what we know of the disciples of Jesus. They were almost exclusively Galileans, with the exception of Judas Iscariot, by the way. We also know that Jesus' early teaching was in the synagogues in Galilee. We know that from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that he traveled with his disciples around Galilee and taught in the synagogues. Interestingly enough, too, and this is more historical, but the question comes up, what are the roots of the Gospel of John, and when was it written and by whom? Those are questions that are really interesting questions historically, but also kind of theologically, too. There's one event that if you're a student of the Bible, in the New Testament in particular, there's one event that you need to kind of tack on your mental wall with a really clear sign, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. This was the defining event of Judaism in the first century, in 70 AD. The Romans had been occupying Israel, Judea, Galilee, and so on, for decades. They had a puppet king, Herod the Great, but the Roman governors kept offending Jewish sensibilities. And they weren't really happy with being under the thumb of the Romans anyway. But a revolt began in 66 AD, and it lasted for roughly 5 years. The Romans had a huge problem with this revolt. They had to move in 2 whole legions, but eventually they conquered the rebels. They destroyed Jerusalem. They wiped out the temple. Jesus had prophesied this. He'd said, not one stone will remain on another. This temple, which is so beautiful and which you see, is going to be destroyed. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can visit that. You can see the Temple Mount was wiped clean. And the stones that were originally part of the upper part of the structures in the temple are at the bottom of the walls, way down in the valley. And so you have this thing happening that you need to really, really remember. This was defining for the Jewish people in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed. A small outpost of Jewish rebels lasted down in a fortress by the Dead Sea called Masada. Have any of you been to Israel? Try it sometimes. It's very much worth it. But take a biblical tour, not just a kind of tourist, oh, this is the church, but seriously looking at biblical backgrounds. On the western side of the Dead Sea, Jerusalem is here, and down here is the Dead Sea. And on the western side of it is a fortress which is called Masada. And it's built on this very high plateau, and it was extremely defensible. It took the Romans 2 years to finally crack it. And it's probably the single most important place in Jewish thinking for today in Israel. of a symbol of their independence and the fact that they will prevail in against their enemies. The motto is never again. And so anyway, that's AD 70. Now, why is this important? It's important in respect to the Gospel of John, I think, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Judaism before the destruction of the temple was a much more multifaceted faith than afterwards. There were all kinds of different groups. We talked about the main groups of the Pharisees, the temple hierarchy, their ideological friends, the Sadducees, but there were other groups too. There were communes that were religious groups down, again, by the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written and copied by one of these groups. But there were all kinds of groups that were in opposition to the temple authorities and things. But after AD 70, a group of Pharisees, a group of rabbis, went with Roman permission to a town called Yavne, Y-A-V-N-A-H. And they started narrowing Judaism. They started putting Judaism to be equal to Phariseeism. And so what became standard Judaism was rooted in the Pharisees. But the temple was gone. So they didn't have any opposition from the temple authorities. They were gone. The temple was no longer there. So Judaism, as it became Judaism, was defined by this group of rabbis. But the early Jesus movement was a Jewish movement. These were Messianic Jews. Almost all of Jesus' early followers were Jewish. And now the connection, most of them initially came from Galilee. Now, why is this important with the Gospel of John? I find it interesting. It doesn't prove something, but it's a very interesting observation that when the Gospel of John is talking about locations and things in Galilee, there's no explanation. The geography, it just kind of assumes, yeah, you know where that is. But when it's talking about Judea, and particularly the geography and topography of Jerusalem, there's all these little explanations. Like Bethesda, the pool at Bethesda and Jesus healing there. It explains, this is what it looked like, this is where it was located, it was near this gate, and something's going on there, which I think makes a lot of sense if you see the original Jesus movement as being rooted in Galilee originally, and the Gospel of John having its roots in eyewitness testimony from Galilee. It's just an interesting observation. It doesn't prove anything, but I find it really interesting. Now, here's another interesting fact. After the Romans were always putting down Jewish rebellions, but the big rebellion, of course, ended up with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. The Galilean Jews who became slaves, many of them, or fled from the Romans, ended up in what we know now as Turkey, modern Turkey, Asia Minor, and particularly along the southern coast. There is a very deep historical tradition that the Gospel of John originated around the southern town of Ephesus, which was the major Roman town in Asia Minor. That was their province there. And that it was written originally to the Jesus people of that area. And so I find it really interesting that the Gospel of John, if it was written after the fall of Jerusalem, which I have concluded that it was, and is the last of the Gospels, that it was rooted in the preaching of John in that area around Ephesus. Do you remember the book of Revelation, the first 3 chapters? Do you remember what's in there? It's an appearance, right? It's a revelation of Jesus, but there are letters to 7 churches. Those 7 churches are on a Roman post route that ran from Ephesus up to the north and back again. So interestingly, the book of Revelation with its 7 churches are the 7 churches that are in kind of a beadwork string leading back to Ephesus, which was the main center. So we'll talk about this more, but I think that as we look at this, we have to realize that Jesus and his disciples were originally from Galilee. And it makes a lot of sense as I understand this, that Jesus went back to Galilee when he started facing danger and opposition from the authorities in Jerusalem. So let's look at the last 8 verses of chapter 4. So Jesus came again to Canaan in Galilee, where he'd made the water wine. And at Capernaum, that was down the hill from Cana, there was an official whose son was ill. This was probably one of the Jewish nobility who had some kind of authority in Capernaum under the Jewish administration. And it says, his son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And the official said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. And Jesus said to him, Go, your son will live. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. And as he was going down, his servants met him and told him his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. And the father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, Your son will live. And he himself believed, and all his household. This was the second sign. The first was the water to wine in Cana, that Jesus had done when he'd come from Judea into Galilee. There are 2 Cana stories. There's the story of water into wine, and there's the story of the healing of this son of this court official. He was a member of the Jewish leadership that governed Galilee, and this is a remarkable story. It's a long-distance healing, and he sought Jesus' help for his child, or it could also mean a servant who had become very precious to him. The word's kind of ambiguous. But the account in Matthew 8 and Luke 7 relates this to a Roman centurion, which is an incident, if the 2 accounts are not overlaid on each other, that evidently happened quite a bit later. And perhaps the centurion had heard reports about the healing that John's gospel talks about. But at any rate, this Jewish court official comes to Jesus and asks him to heal his son who was close to death. And he asks him to come and heal the child. It's an interesting word. It means paidion is the word in Greek, and it means little guy. Heal this little guy. before he dies. I think I mentioned before, fevers and illness, childhood illness, were a much more serious thing before antibiotics were discovered. Even in the 19th century, the 1800s, 50% of children that were born in England, and that was Great Britain, was the top of the pile in terms of nations. 50% of all children died before the age of 10. That's mind-blowing for us today. We can't even understand what that means. But at any rate, Jesus says, go, your son will live. And his faith is he's going downhill, literally, to Capernaum, and he's healed, and he himself then believes, it says in verse 53 and 54, and all his household. I'd like to make just one comment about that phrase, and his household. That kind of sounds sometimes a little strange to us if we really think about it. We have a very individualistic culture, obviously. But the household in the ancient world, whether it was Jewish or Greek or Roman, the household was not simply a house or even a family. It was a social and cultural unit. It was an extended family, if you will. Things didn't happen privately. They happened in the household. That's true in many non-Western cultures today. A household represents an extended family. Often, as I mentioned before about Capernaum, where they're excavating now the house that is presumed to be Simon Peter's house, was different small houses around a central courtyard. It includes parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, servants, and even financial dependents. When the head of the house, I hesitate to use this word, but the godfather, if you will, when the head of the house made a decision for Jesus, it often started the first step in a movement of an entire household of people coming to faith. And it's the first step of a movement. And John's gospel recognized this and respects it, while at the same time emphasizing the need for a consistent and personal faith in Christ. So, what happened when a household believed like that? When faith in Jesus came in? Well, in the first century, the first and most observable act would probably have been the removal of the household gods, if it were a pagan household. That would have been a major shock to the neighborhood. You know, these carrying out your gods and throwing them on the trash heap. And if it were large enough, the house may have become a meeting place for the group of believers in that area. As you read through the letters of the Apostle Paul, you find these interesting phrases, usually in the last chapter. You know, he says, Silas is writing this for me, and I greet you all, and I greet so-and-so and so-and-so, and be sure to greet so-and-so and so-and-so, and the church that is in their house. So the sort of central social unit of early Christianity was the household, this extended family. And Paul would send his greetings to the fathers and mothers of these households, so to speak, where the churches met. Assuming that this official was Jewish, he probably became more pious from a Jewish perspective, and he began structuring his life around the teachings of Jesus. By the way, Galilee, Sermon on the Mount, there were these small communities of Jesus people sprinkled all over Galilee by this time. And the prophet Micah explained very clearly what is required of us to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God, Micah 6:8. And this Jewish official may have begun hosting a little Jesus people group in this extended family, in this household. In Capernaum, there was already another household, Simon's household, where this Jesus group was meeting. So this official may have started simply going to the gatherings held at Peter's place. But it wouldn't surprise me, with this emphasis on the household, if he began to host meetings in his own home where Jesus people would come. And these were kind of proto-churches before the death and resurrection of Jesus. These were the groups that became the household churches later. And throughout the Roman world and Greek world, when the apostles went out to the Gentiles, this very same pattern repeated itself. As we said from the letters of the Apostle Paul, the church was not a building in the early years. It was a household. It was a place where there was a group of people. And after Jesus' resurrection, these groups changed even further. They began baptizing new converts, and they began meeting not on Shabbat, but on the first day of the week and celebrating the Lord's Supper or communion at least every week in a meeting that was outside of the synagogue. These groups were the seed beds of what sociologists would call a people movement. A whole new structure of society rose up. And this, in my thinking, is the background of what was going on and why the Gospel of John was written. If, as I think, the Gospel of John was written when the source person of the Gospel, or the author of the Gospel, was a very old man, the last of the disciples, living and teaching in Ephesus, and there's a lot of historical evidence that John the Apostle was located in Ephesus and in Asia Minor. And if he was telling his stories to a group of his disciples, and they were being written down because he was getting to be an old man, what was happening in, let's say, the 90s, which would be kind of the last phase of John's life, what was happening was two things. First of all, the Jesus movement was still essentially a Jewish movement. The Jesus people in that area were still going to synagogue. If they were Jews, they were going there as full Jews, worshiping in the synagogue worship, or sometimes Gentiles attended synagogue services. They were allowed to do that as they were called God-fearers. And so the Jesus people that John was dealing with, these small house groups, house churches, they were attending synagogue. And they were also worshiping on the first day of the week. Why is this important? Remember what I said about what happened to Judaism after Jerusalem was destroyed. The Pharisees began narrowing Judaism from about 75 AD. And what became Jewish became more and more narrow. And there is strong evidence that the rabbis began squeezing the followers of Jesus and other Jewish groups that weren't Pharisees out of the synagogues. They were persecuting them, they were disciplining them, they were getting them out of the synagogue. Why is that important? Well, first of all, obviously, if you're Jewish and you've been in the synagogue your entire life, but you're not going to deny your faith in Jesus, there's a conflict here. But there was another problem, and we're going to be talking about this on the edges of John chapter 9, which is the story of someone being kicked out of the synagogue in the lifetime of Jesus and during his teaching. There was a significant problem. The Jews had a very special exemption in the Roman Empire. They're the only people that had it. Through a whole combination of historical circumstances, they did not have to engage in emperor worship. They were allowed to pray for the emperor, which they did. But they didn't have to perform emperor worship. They didn't have to go before an altar and offer sacrifice like every other Roman citizen did.
This stemmed from Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel?
No, this was Roman. This was, obviously it's the same idea.
Yeah, this stem, like, is that where, like, okay, you guys have had this issue before, we're going to let you not worship? Was that within the realm of their thinking?
I'm sure that the Jewish people were thinking about
Right,
that.
I'm sure the Jewish, but the
Right.
Romans like, actually, this has actually happened before, and people...
I'm not sure the Romans knew the history, but the actual thing that got them this exemption was interesting. Julius Caesar got himself in deep, deep trouble in Alexandria. He was there with his army, and he faced some military opposition, really serious stuff. And so the family of Herod that became the puppet king of the Romans sent military reinforcements and saved Caesar's bacon, basically, in Alexandria. And as a reward, Herod, or his officials, explained to the Romans, hey, guys, we're kind of a unique group of people. We don't worship anybody except the one God, and it's really difficult for us to perform military service for you guys, apart from using our own armies. And Caesar said, great, you're exempt from military service, and you don't have to do emperor worship. Just pray for the emperor, which at that time he wasn't the emperor, but later became defined as prayer for the emperor. So this was kind of a special treaty that the Romans had worked out on the basis of the help that Herod's father, I believe, and Herod gave to Julius Caesar, and the Romans honored that. So the Jews were in this special category. They weren't very many people. I mean, they were in the single-digit percentage of the Roman Empire, so it was no real skin off the Romans' nose that they allowed this. But if you were Jewish, you didn't have to do sort of the annual ritual of performing a sacrifice to the emperor, going up and sprinkling wine on the altar and things like that. The problem was that if you got kicked out of the synagogue, and the Jewish leaders of your town and synagogue, who were led by the rabbis by that time, said, they're not Jewish. They were obligated to do emperor worship. And so you have this huge tension growing of who are truly Jewish, who are the true Jews, and what about emperor worship? And the book of Revelation deals with this whole issue of emperor worship, obviously in its own way with these incredible apocalyptic pictures and things. But the issue of emperor worship is at the center of the book of Revelation. So, just to dial back, we've been a long journey tonight, talking about a lot of things. But if you kind of picture this, I wish, I'm going to try to get a whiteboard, and maybe, I normally like to also use PowerPoint and different stuff. But if you can just imagine, as I mentioned once before, two concentric circles. The inside circle is the world of the text of John's gospel. It's the stories that the Gospel of John relates about Jesus. It's the structure, the literary structure that it has. I mentioned bookending and the first three chapters dealing with the early disciples of Jesus, and these two conversations being compared in John 3 and John 4. And we're going to go on, and Jesus, up until chapter 12, he's going to be interacting and interfacing with different groups and different situations in Jewish life. In particular, different Jewish festivals. But that's all there. That's the world of the story. That's the story world. That's the world of the text. It's the report that's being given. But this other world, this other circle on the outside, I like to call it the audience world, is that if John was a pastor, if he was an old man, if he was the leader of the Jesus movement in this whole area, he was asking himself, what do my people need to know? What are the stories about Jesus that are important to them? In their dealing with this issue of conflict with the Jews, which by the Jews I take in the Gospel of John to mean the Judaizers, the Jewish rabbis in Judea, which later became sort of standard Judaism. How do you deal with them? How did Jesus deal with them? How did my Lord interact with these people? What about Samaritans? What about people that are non-Jews? And so this audience world, I think, is like any good author, any good teacher. John was asking himself, what do my people need to understand? And we're going to see, from here on out, basically, John is going to be outlining what he thinks the Jesus people need to understand. They need to understand what happens when you get kicked out of the synagogue. They need to have the courage to face that. They need to know how Jesus viewed that. So he includes this story that nobody else tells in John chapter 9 about the man who was born blind and gets healed and gets kicked out of the synagogue for his faith in Jesus. It's going to deal with issues like what about household communities like Lazarus and his sisters? What about death? They're all questions that a pastor and teacher, a shepherd, is asking himself, what do my people need to hear? What do they need to know? And so you find John is distinctly different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I think it's because they were dealing with different issues, different problems. And he was telling different aspects of Jesus' story in order to help the people that he was ministering to. It's kind of exciting, really. It's just kind of like, wow, that opens up a whole different world. So, if I'm right, obviously I think I'm right, but if I'm right, and there are people that agree with me completely, that have studied this a lot, I think the Gospel of John is a unique witness to Jesus. But I think it's a witness that's rooted in history. It's rooted in the real world of Jesus. And we'll keep talking about the fact that most of the things that happen in the Gospel of John took place in Judea, which is the southern area. It's his encounters with the Jewish religious authorities there, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk mostly about his teaching in the synagogues in the northern part in Galilee. So, well, it's kind of a trip. It's something that's a lot of, I hope you catch some of the excitement of reading the Gospel of John in a new way. I think it just, light bulbs begin going on if you understand what's actually happening in the Gospel of John. So,
Is that why, or usually when somebody first, accepts the Lord, they usually tell you to study the Gospel of John?
Yes.
Like that's the foundation.
Yeah.
Of
Greetings to Patrick. Yes. Somebody asked a question, I think it was the first evening, what Gospels I recommend to people that come to faith. And the Gospel of John is a perfect gospel for someone who has a religious consciousness, who perhaps comes from some kind of vague religious background. I don't recommend the Gospel of John in Berlin, where I live, to atheists. The Gospel I recommend they read is the Gospel of Luke. And you open the Gospel of Luke, and Luke says, he's very, very much the scientist, the historian. He says, I've researched this thoroughly, I've checked all the sources, and this is the narrative as it took place, and by the way, this is real. And for an atheist, that's kind of like, oh, okay, I know what I'm dealing with here. This is at least a document that claims to be a historical record. It's right there. And so when I'm talking with atheists, and we talk about if they've never read the Bible, which you find those folk in Berlin in particular, in Germany where I live, I recommend that they start with the Gospel of Luke. Because I think it's just easier for them to get into it. And then from there. So, yeah. Other comments, questions, thoughts? Thank you, guys. It's a privilege to be with you always.
Thank you.
Yeah, next week we start John chapter 5, which is an exciting place to be, talking about the works of Jesus, the works of God. So we'll see you then. Blessings. Have a good week.